why don't you do us a run through of models, project management models?
Okay, well, I mean, of course, the classical one is the waterfall where you're defining everything up front, tons of documentation to define exactly what is required, and then throwing those docs over the wall for the engineers to code.
Yeah, waterfall is fantastic if you're building a submarine. Other than that,
So, and of course, there's the agile bucket. I guess I'll consider there's waterfall and agile as the two big buckets, and there's a whole
right.
bunch of different stuff under agile. So, and agile to me, and it probably means a lot of things to different people, but to me, it means getting as close to the people who have the requirements and working very closely with them. So it's not as siloed. There doesn't have to be as much documentation. There's more real-time interaction between the people who need the product, designing the product, and the people who are building the product.
Right.
And with Agile, I mean, there's Scrum, there's Kanban, there's Scrumban, which combines Scrum and Kanban, Lean, extreme programming. Yeah.
Right. So it seems like the industry, that the web development industry, is mostly settling around Scrum and Kanban. That's what I run into almost exclusively. Nobody uses waterfall anymore in the context of project management for web development, because it's just documentation like that. That level of pre-documentation is obsolete as soon as you're finished writing it, as fast as this moves. If you're doing something like developing the Mars rover, you need big upfront thinking like that, and documentation. You have to be very careful. But for something like web development, programming, it moves too fast, and you're just going to spend a lot of time on documentation that is of zero usefulness 2 days after it's finished.
Yeah, and then the other thing that is different, like even with, like if you're developing something for a Mars mission or a submarine, that's software you're going to write once and patch very little. Or if you have a on-the-shelf piece of software you're going to put out there, that version of software is going to be out there for a long time, say 2 decades ago. But nowadays, when you can have a release every 5 minutes if you want of a different version, yeah, it's because you have that malleability, being able to make changes so quickly. Having all that rigid documentation up front makes less and less sense for, as you're saying, for web development and a lot of other forms of development.
Yeah. So waterfall still has a place, just not, I don't think, in programming or web development. Other industries
or the programming of web programming or probably mobile programming.
Right.
But it also depends if your application has to be critical to like a human life and you need multiple redundancies or something like that.
True. I guess, like programming the space shuttle needs some forethought to it and some documentation. Yeah. But yeah, in the context of like business web development, yeah, I think most people have left behind those type of heavy modeling and have moved to Scrum or Kanban, or a combination of the two is what I see most often, actually. So let's talk about what is Scrum and Kanban in a general, I mean, not too deep, because there's whole courses on Scrum. So we can't do all of that. But, yeah, that's right. But what are those two things?
Well, I mean, Scrum is basically usually defining a particular product backlog. So the product owner kind of defines, hey, we are the things that we need to build. And then the development team tackles those in usually weekly, I think, sprints. So they define kind of what slice of that product backlog they're going to take on and deliver a functional piece of software at the end of that, say, week, if the sprint is a week long.
Okay.
How do you understand it?
Uh,
I haven't actually used it. I haven't actually used Scrum in any capacity.
right. Well, I have used it quite a bit. However, I will say that, I read all the Scrum books and understood the process and stuff. Not once in any real project have I ever not modified that somehow to fit that team and that product. There's no, if you do it by the book, it's not going to succeed very well, I don't think, because it just, there are so many variables that go into just that sprint, just that 1 or 2 or 4 week movement of code and product, that you can't encapsulate that in a static methodology. It has to be fluid. And I think, to be honest, that extreme programming and Scrum and things were intended as guidelines for fluid development processes that could change without massive problems. So I think that's what their intent is. So, and so, yeah, Scrum to me is just short. You deliver business value very quickly, within weeks, small bits of business value many times, as opposed to once a year you put out a bunch of business value. Right. So that's kind of what agile development is to me. And it's faster communication, faster feedback from things outside of development. Getting things into testing and QA, getting them into final users' hands, doing quick alpha testing, and
well, all of that's kind of agile, but as opposed to the actual Scrum process, right?
It is. So Scrum is essentially those terms, from what I'm talking to people, have almost become interchangeable. So when someone says agile in a web development environment, they generally mean Scrum, and vice versa. They don't really make a distinction in the field anymore between those things. Scrum is it does have a lot of technical bits to it. And it's important to understand all those so that you can take that framework and modify it to fit what you're working on. But it's not really, I don't think that Scrum is practiced in a I can't think of the word I'm looking for. It's not,
or do development shops say they're doing Scrum, but they're not really doing Scrum as it's described on the website?
I mean, yeah, but like I said, I've never been in a position where I have done Scrum exactly like it's described on the website. It's always some kind of modification of that framework.
Yeah, I mean, like the development shops I work with, they say, okay, we do a stand-up and we talk about what we're doing. They do stand-up, so they do some aspects of it, and then they do the work that they're going to achieve for the given week on a particular segment of work to do.
Right.
And, of course, the product owners have their own set of things that are, but it's more, I'll use a technical term, loosey-goosey. It's much more loosey-goosey than actually described on, the methodologies and whatnot.
Right.
When you look at the website, when you look at books, or if you're becoming a certified Scrum Master, or, whatever it is. I mean, I can see if you have a big project to do with a defined timeline, then adhering more to the process makes sense. Now, for example, I'll bring up some of my history, and the tool that I most used when I did, now the biggest projects I have done have actually been system migrations. So they weren't greenfield development projects. They weren't me doing a programming language, but it was actually implementing a new software package in an organization. Like think of a module of an ERP solution or something of that nature. And I ran the project using Microsoft Project, which probably everybody's like, oh no. But, that was, and like Agile wasn't a thing when I ran this project. Right. And Agile was, of course, more akin to software development. But there, the processes were, okay, breaking out the tasks needing to do, putting the dependencies in between those tasks. So there was still a process to it. Was it a waterfall? Not necessarily. Again, I think that's more of a software development, more applied to software development. But it was basically tracking each task and then being able to determine when the end date was, because we had a date to go live. Whereas a lot of software development projects, basically we want to get this feature in by this quarter, or we want the first version of it by this time frame. It's more, there's more flexibility, right? I think, to be able to cut scope, to hit a time if you need it, or extend the time a little bit if you want to achieve a particular scope.
And I think that's necessary, that flexible thinking, because web development, every project I've been on, when somebody says, hey, I want this new feature, it's usually something that is thinking way outside what's actually been done, especially in the scope of that product. So you have to spend time. You can't just say, oh yeah, that'll take me 2 days. Because you have to spend time doing some investigation and tinkering with things and finding out, okay, what's this really going to take? And sometimes by the time you get to that determination, you're almost done with it. So it's, it gets a little tricky. And so I think the intent of Scrum and the Agile methodologies is to be able to do that kind of movement.
Now, what about Kanban? Because I don't have any exposure to that. I mean, I know there's a Kanban board, and you move things over and whatnot. Have you actually, other than people using Trello or something like that, have you ever used a Kanban board?
Most Agile project management tools, and we'll look at some here in a minute, most of them have what I would consider a Kanban board that they use for, especially for their issue tracking and work assignments. So I think those things kind of go hand in hand, just based on necessity, because Kanban isn't really the methodology. I don't think it's more like the tool you use to implement Agile methodologies.
I think there is actually a bit of a system, but
there is a Kanban methodology technically, but I don't really run into it that way in the wild.
It's no one says, hey, we're doing Kanban.
Right. It's usually they're doing Kanban insofar as they're using that as a model to implement their Agile methodology.
Yeah.
And so, I almost always see them together anymore, especially if you're actually using like electronic online tools and stuff to do the project management. They almost all have something like that.
If you like this clip and want to watch another one, you can click right here. Or if you want to watch the full video, you can click here.